Jewish faith, but she's going to talk more about her own personal experiences and why she's here.
Hi. Statistically, estimates of the number of incest survivors vary. The discrepancy can be attributed to the fact that incest remains an extremely underreported crime. According to some statistics, 46% of children who are sexually violated are victimized by a family member. To explain why the Windows legislation is so important, I would like to share my story with you. It's not that much different than many other incest survivors. To the outside world, I grew up in a very typical upper-middle-class, loving suburban family, a family in which both my parents were seen as honorable and respectable. My father worked very long hours, and my mother was very active, volunteering time at the local PTA and Girl Scouts. We were a family that did things together. Unfortunately, there was another side to my childhood, one in which was supposed to be kept secret. I was taught from a very early age it was very important to be loyal to the family. That meant keeping what went on at home secret. No one would have ever guessed that my mother was being battered or that my father had an explosive temper. Like many other children who grew up in an abusive environment, my siblings and I believed it was much better for us to use our tiny little bodies to protect my mother from being hurt. There was another secret that I kept for many years. I was being sexually abused at home. I don't know how old I was when the sexual abuse began. When I was very young, I just thought it was one of the many ways that a parent would show a child that they were loved. The abuse was done with very tender, loving care. As I got older, I started feeling funny about what was happening. By the time I was in high school, I began to refuse to be touched sexually. By doing so meant that the physical abuse got worse. I didn't know what to do to make the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse stop. When I was 16, I attempted suicide for the first time. I remembered a school counselor asking me if I was being sexually abused at home. My response was no. I figured, what good would it do to say yes? He was unable to help me with the physical abuse that I disclosed to him, and I was too embarrassed to tell him, yes, I was being raped at home. Both the physical and sexual abuse ended when I was in my early 20s. Unfortunately, on many levels, the emotional abuse still occurs. When I was 20 was the first time I confronted my mother about both the physical and sexual abuse. Her reaction was to tell my father what I said. At first, both of my parents disclosed to me that they were also sexually abused as children. The strange thing is that both my parents denied ever being abusive towards me. Because I refused to recant my story, I was basically cut out of the family. There were a few brief respites of my exile, yet from that point on, I basically no longer had parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, or siblings. I was no longer invited to family functions. I was not allowed to watch my nieces and nephews grow up. I no longer was seen as part of my family. I became nobody's child. Like most other incest survivors, I would often ask myself, how does one sue their parents? How does one emotionally put themselves in a place to do such a thing? Last year, I began communicating with a relative of mine who I hadn't seen for 25 years. During the conversation, my relative disclosed to me that she was ordered not to communicate with me until the statute of limitations had expired in the state of Illinois. I am now 48. After that conversation I had with my relative, I could not stop crying. It finally hit me how much I've lost. I finally found the courage at that time to talk to an attorney about filing a civil suit against my offenders. The problem is that in the eyes of the law, it has taken me too much time to come to this point. I'm not alone. Many other adult survivors of child sexual abuse are also facing the same stumbling block. Without the Windows legislation, my offenders and the offenders of other survivors can never be held accountable for their actions. I also want to make it a point that on average, an incest survivor will first seek treatment when they're in their 30s or 40s. And I know so many survivors now who are in their 50s and 60s and 70s who are just beginning to disclose that they were sexually abused. They're not even in a place to file a civil suit yet. Thank you.
Matt Contay is going to speak next. He's from Delaware and is a survivor and did a phenomenal job in Delaware, mobilizing, I don't know how many groups, 70-some in Child Victims Voice, the name of the group, and he has now become an activist, and he's going to give us a few minutes.
Thanks very much, Marcy. Why statute of limitations reform for child sexual abuse? The question that we have before us here. These crimes thrive on secrecy. The sexual abuse of children, by its very nature, is perpetrated in secret. Meanwhile, perpetrators often find new victims over a period of decades. Victims are silenced by things like fear, threats, shame, self-hatred, and even suicide. We need this reform because the deck is stacked against victims ever coming forward. I think Marcy mentioned 10% is an estimate of how many are able to. To ask, for example, a 9-year-old to realize the extent of the harm that he or she has suffered by the time that they're age 11 and to seek civil remedy is not only unconscionable, it's not realistic. In fact, that was the law in my home state of Delaware until a few months ago. The sexual abuse of children is a society-wide public health epidemic in the United States. By being here today, I feel that we're truly part of what Professor Hamilton calls the civil rights movement for children. In my mind, this issue is a simple one. Either you're for protecting children or you're not. It seems to be an easy choice for all except for special interest groups. These special interest groups are only interested in protecting things like secrets, dirty secrets, and resources, money, and reputations. And they often said that we support SB 29, that was the name of our successful bill in Delaware. We support it, but, and then you fill in the blank. There are a whole lot of things there. The California civil window legislation model showed us that the civil window is the single most effective legislation to expose sexual predators who aren't going to appear on any sex offender registry. And during this whole process, we didn't let the special interest opposition distort the scope of the bill, which we limited to reforming the statute of limitations for all victims of child sexual abuse. And during the process, we had a relentless watchword. It was no crippling amendments. Because by studying this issue all over the country and how it had failed in so many other states, we discovered that the bills were diluted to death by amendments. So we kept up with the mantra that was, support this bill with no amendments, and in the end that's what they did. In other words, a technical amendment about the money being appropriated, something along those lines, but no amendments of substance were passed. Don't get me wrong, we were extremely successful and it happened in a relatively short period of time. Senator Peterson will probably talk more about those details. But none of it was easy, and especially for someone who is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse himself. To the contrary, it was an arduous process, it was all-consuming, it was often brutal and maddening. But our legislative victory is the result of many late hours, time away from work and loved ones, a great emotional, financial, and physical toll. I felt that passing this bill wasn't something that I wanted to do, it was something that I had to do. It was personal. I had kept my perpetrator's dirty secret for my own for far too long. And when I joined this effort at the end of last year, I feel I was truly transformed from a victim to a survivor by using my voice in a way that I could not as a child. This effort has transformed my personal recovery from the abuse into a public cause to use my long silence voice to speak up for the voiceless. Thank you.